Matthew, I wonder what's being evoked in you, but as I was just sitting there in the silence, I had this sense of all your beautiful comments, like all of these threads being invited to knit them together into this one-ing, taking us deep into the ground of our heart, and that somehow in that heart consciousness or the Christ consciousness that's emerging today in this community, that perhaps some ways of responding in that via transformativa might emerge in a whole new creative way.
Well, that's beautiful. I must say I was very moved by all the responses here, and some that came up as questions and some as observations. You know, you can tell there's a great depth in this room, and the people here are at home with silence. It's not always the case in our times.
It's a beautiful gift, that silence, isn't it? I was touching it into the ground each time we've joined in that silence, and you can touch it, can't you?
Yes.
Quite palpable.
Someone told me that you just spent 2 weeks in Julian Norwich's cell. Is that a rumor or is that real?
It's true.
You're that crazy. How wonderful. What did it do for you? Speaking of silence.
Yes.
I've been in that cell.
Yes, it's beautiful. Yes, I just felt really called to just be and to sit in her space, in her sacred space. My own formation comes from Julian. I did my original research on her showings, and my thesis was on, this was my question really, and I was just saying to Robbie before, it is that in Julian, it is the movement that you describe of via positiva, via negativa, via creativa and via transformativa, and it was on one-ing, so salvation is one-ing, and at the time the question of my life really was, I suppose, what was the meaning of suffering, or maybe that's where it started. However, what became more and more clear to me as I entered into Julian's texts for many years is that our being is in God, that we have this eternal memory that our being is in God. We are one, we always have been and always will be in God, and that we touch that now. I touch it personally now in my own being, and we can connect with that here. And this is where I see the Spirit working at the moment, I think, in Australian spiritual direction, that we might start to really find some quite concrete ways of giving expression to what's emerging from that centre of one-ing that we all dwell within. And that it actually has a face. It's the Christic face, or the Buddha face.
And you're talking panentheism there.
I am.
Yes. all things are in God, and God is in all things.
Absolutely.
Like water in the fish, and fish in the water.
Yes.
And you know, this is so easily forgotten that Paul uses the phrase "in Christ." 132 times. I mean, he was obsessed with that phrase. He couldn't get rid of it. But, you know, John Dominic Crossan in his book on Paul says that for Paul, you can't be a Christian without being a mystic.
You can't, that's right.
And that phrase of being in Christ, or in God, is panentheism. So it deconstructs the notion of theism, that we're here and God's up there, we're calling God in. And that's really important. A lot of atheism is simply rejection of theism.
Exactly.
No theism, thank you. They've never heard of panentheism because mysticism is so dead in most of our seminaries and theological schools. And you know, we're mystically illiterate, I think, at this time in history. But you're not. I mean, because that phrase "in God, in Christ" just came up naturally for you. And it changes everything.
It changes everything. And it changes everything in spiritual direction. Because we begin with the via positiva, as you say, of the awe and the wonder and the beauty, that we are a reflection of the divine. And it seems to me in spiritual companioning, that's what we're always longing, that those that we accompany might ground into and give expression from, and be just absolutely homely with God in it. So that's why I find spiritual direction such a creative and exciting and evolutionary thing to do, that I do believe can change in this very underground way.
Yeah, maybe it's not just evolutionary, maybe it's revolutionary.
Well, I hope so. and I love, you're often referred to as a radical, Matthew.
Am I?
And when I looked up the internet, and I thought two of my favourite books are Judy Canato's Radical Amazement, and
which is great from Rabbi Heschel.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Beatrice Brutto, Radical Optimism. And I was thinking, isn't that what we want to be as spiritual directors? To have that radical amazement and radical optimism, and to know this ground. And when we're really in that, then we're in the ground of the soul of the earth. And so our story is never disconnected from Earth's story. We are the Ha'adamas, aren't we? And it seems to me too, that's what we're wanting to do in spiritual direction. Yes, I tell my own sacred story, and at the same time, I tell Earth's sacred story. Like we can't actually disconnect them. And as you were saying too, it's embodied. Like Julian would say, God is in our sensuality.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Sacred sensuality.
When I wrote my book on sensual spirituality, called We All the Hill, and I got a letter from a former professor of mine, a Dominican historian, who was well known as an historian because he taught at the Toronto School of Theology at their medieval institute there. And he said, I'll never read another book of yours again, because you use the word spirituality and sensuality in the same sentence. And this guy's specialty was 14th century science and religion. Yeah, I know it. So he didn't know Julian
No, he obviously didn't.
Well, that's typical that women, her book was not published until the 17th century.
Yes.
Till a Benedictine got in an argument with a Jesuit, and then finally Julian got published 300 years after her death, which is kind of a long wait for a book review, wouldn't it? But I like the question here about the body, and that's what you're getting to with the earth. Our bodies are literally 13.8 billion years old. 60% of your atoms were cooked in the fireball 13.8 billion years ago, and the other 40%, your new side, was cooked in a supernova, 4.5 billion years ago. So, far from putting down our bodies, which so much spirituality, in quotation marks, has tried to do, our bodies are linked. They carry the history. And this whole idea that we've turned matter into a boogeyman, that my body made me do it, or my sensuality made me do it. No, it's just the opposite. What science now tells us is that, like David Bohm, the physicist, says, matter is frozen light. Frozen light. Or other scientists, it's very slow-moving light. Okay, whatever. It's light. And what we now know is that for every molecule of light in the world that's enfleshed, like our bodies are, or the trees are, everything we look at here is, there are billion molecules of light that are not enfleshed. And so instead of flesh being the problem, flesh is a rarity in the universe, 1 in a billion. That's who we are with our bodies. And so this whole dualism we've had dumped on us by Plato and Augustine and other men who have been afraid of matter, it's over now. Science has killed it. Because when I did my study on world spiritualities, one of the themes was light. And I found that light is the number one synonym for divinity around the world. And so light is as close as you can get to God as we can get with symbols. And of course, in Genesis, light is the first thing, birth. So the idea that we've been putting light that is matter down is appalling, and this is why we need a revolution, not just an evolution. Yes. Because this is why we have an ecological crisis. Because we've been blaming our mistakes on matter, which of course is also mater, mother, and that has something to do with patriarchy too. It's mom's fault. Have you ever heard that before? So, this whole thing is, and that's what's so wonderful about Julian, that she's so integrated. But I have to give Eckhart credit too, because I think she stands on Eckhart's shoulders like Eckhart stands on Aquinas' shoulders. And, the reason Aquinas says, the reason he didn't write a single book on Plato or on Augustine is that, and he wrote 10 books on Aristotle, is that Aristotle does not denigrate matter. So from that point of view, Aquinas was carrying on a non-dualistic tradition. And he got in a lot of trouble for it. They condemned him 3 times before they canonized him a saint after all. So he must have said something more interesting than Thomas saying. And he did. So anyway, I want to speak to this wonderful questions that came out of this group. I couldn't believe that you guys met for just 20 minutes. It seemed like 4 hours. But here's one point that really hit me, was the point about passion, that is so important. I think one of the most important philosophical debates in the West happened in the Middle Ages between Bonaventure and Aquinas. Bonaventure said, and Bonaventure was originally Aristotelian and worked with Aquinas, then he backed off and became Platonic again. And then they made him a cardinal and all that, so it was good for his career. But the point I want to make, and I would be arguing with Richard Rohr if you were in the room on this too, is this. Bonaventure and the whole Augustinian tradition says virtue lies in the will. Now to me that's pure patriarchy. Aquinas said no, virtue lies in the passions. And they really went at it like that, passionately I may say. But that's what I heard you saying. You see that that's why introvert meditation is not enough to make you a prophet. Prophets are passionate, and Rabbi Heschel talks about that. He's the scholar and practitioner on prophecy. As he says, the prophets were not ascetic; they were passionate, and they were also artists. The via creativa. Some of the greatest poetry in the world is from Isaiah and Jeremiah and other prophets. But so I just think that's a really important question today. I'm so glad you brought up the subject of passion. And again, it is part of the feminist dimension of seeing the world. That we're not here to sit on our passions, including anger and moral outrage. We want to steer them in effective and constructive ways. And that's what nonviolence does, among others. And all creativity does that. So I just think that's a really hot issue today because, again, from the East, some Eastern teachers will say, oh, well, anger is just the worst thing you can do. No, it's not. The worst thing you can do is sit on your anger. Aquinas says nothing great happens without anger. He says a trustworthy person is angry at the right people for the right reasons, expresses it in the appropriate manner and for the appropriate length of time. So tap into that third chakra. Tap into your moral outrage. But don't let it run. And I'll give you one more example. Then I'll shut up. I'm talking to you. You got me on the subject. This is what Eckhart says about passion. He says, put on your passions a bridle of love. And that will carry you far further than all the ascetic practices of the world, he says. Now notice that image, bridle of love. What's a bridle? It's a stirring instrument for a stallion. We've all got stallions inside of us. It's about our joy. It's about our sense of injustice and moral outrage and love and the rest. But instead of locking your horse up in the barn and calling that spiritual, get smart. Develop a bridle. But even your bridle, which is a steering instrument for your passions, that's what a bridle is, but even your bridle is non-dualistic, a bridle of love. So love your passions, but learn to steer them. Like my father used to say, you have to be smarter than a dog if you're going to have a dog. It's going to run away with you, the same as you do with a horse. So let me shut up, I'm sorry. You got me going.
Passion's one of my passions too.
And Julian's got me going.
Of course, yes. And my sense of passion and evoking that passion for work for justice is to come back to the Rahaman, to our womb, and to the womb of our being, that it's there, and it's the divine eros within us. It's the divine desire, and that when we touch into that divine desire and follow that, then that gives us the energy and also, I think, though, the wisdom to keep coming back and make sure that we're grounded. And coming back to the ground, as Eckhart would say and Julian would say. And to the one who is, Julian would say, I am the ground. That Christ says to us, I am the ground. I am the ground of your prayer. I am the ground of your being. And so to keep coming back to that, and it's the passion from that fire, and it's the passion of the mystical marriage, that this is a profoundly intimate being in one another, so that the two are absolutely one, the one in again. Mm-hmm. And that when that passion is evoked, connecting to the soul of Earth, then we know, in terms of the ecological crisis, that our response is a wise one, that it's wisdom blowing through creation, and it's not my egoic need to control or to have it this way. And that somehow that leaves room for the negativa of the not yet, the unknowing, the emptiness. And someone was repeating a phrase, some of you may well have heard this recently, of that radical place of the space of terror, the terror of this space we're in now, of the past is gone, and the future that's evolving, we're evolving generally into is not yet, and we can't quite see what we might want to commit our life.
Apathy.
Yes.
And that lack of passion, and that's what's really killing the earth. It is our passivity, and it's acedia is the capital sin that we've mistranslated as sloth. But Aquinas says acedia is the lack of energy to begin new things. And he says, where does the energy come from? Where do you get zeal as opposed to apathy or lack of energy, acedia? He says, you get zeal from an intense experience of the beauty of things.
Yes.
In other words, from falling in love. That's what the Via Positiva is all about. I think we should fall in love a minimum of 3 times a day. But of course, if you live in an anthropocentric world, that sounds like a real threat to your marriage or your relationship. But if you open it up to cosmology again, that was a question about resetting everything. Falling in love means you can fall in love with wildflowers, with animals, with birds, with poetry, with music, with life. And that's what's needed, is that passion, that eros, that falling in love. And the opposite is so prevalent that we've invented a word in our time, my lifetime. The word is couch potatoitis. That is a current word for acedia. It's passivity, couch potatoitis. Being passive instead of active, as citizens, as mystics, as prophets. Yeah. By the way, I knew this woman who's been quoted several times tonight. Beatrice. We met very early in her first writing. I saw her master. It was all about the Via Negativa, and it was very deep and very good. But I tried to coach her and say there are these other 3 paths too. Well, she's gotten to them with her ecstasy and everything. But that's what I remember, because way back in the early 70s that I met her and she showed me this manuscript. And I very much encouraged her, but I also kind of warned her, be open to other dimensions that are probably going to come out too. But it's interesting that she began with that, with the Via Negativa.
Yes, and I think that's the culture, or the church culture that we came out of. I certainly began with it myself, looking, and I remember my first retreat, my first 6-day silent retreat, and your book on becoming a musical, mystical bear. And my spiritual director said to me, have you read this book? And it had just come out at that stage. And he was giving me permission to be a mystic, to become a mystic. And if you recall back in those days, especially in the university, if you were associated with mysticism, well, there was a bit of a question. And yet now we've come to the point where we really know that if we are going to survive, it'll only be if we have a mystical consciousness, that we need to have that capacity to behold from within our oneness. So this, I think, I love that title, the playfulness of it, being a musical, mystical bear, and maybe that's what we're all desiring to be right now in a whole new creative, evolutionary way. Yes, but I think that's true with a lot of theology in those days, that we started with the negative because we're always looking for the negative, and we still often do. And I know in my own journey, it was the moment I realised my being is in God, like I was born in the womb, the eternal womb, and that I have that eternal memory. And as you were talking about the stars and that we're part of that flash, we're part of that light, and that we can access that within our own heart. Can we give voice to it? And can we encourage each other to give voice to it? And I love the way Barbara Fionn says in one of her books, it's light that will heal us. It's the light of our own heart that will bring the healing to our planet now. We'll only heal ourselves by light, not by looking for what's wrong, but by accessing the creativity of the divine light and expressing that and enabling it to express itself. So coming back again to the via positiva.
Yeah, I'd like to share before we leave a dream I had a couple of years ago that gave birth to something. It woke me up at 4 a.m. and it said, "Do it," capital letters and 4 exclamation points. I've never had a dream that commanded something like that. What was to do it? To start a new order, not a religious order, but a spiritual order. So I shared it with some young people I know. One was 28, one was 31 at the time, man or woman. And we call it the Order of the Sacred Earth. And turns out the 31-year-old, he had a dream that week too that he considers to be kind of parallel. He dreamt that there was this group of people at the ocean on a beach, and they were meditating and then levitating and over the city of San Francisco and all that. So, make a long story short, we put together a book called Order of the Sacred Earth. I don't think they have any here, but you could get them online or something. And the three of us, the two young ones and myself, wrote 3 essays in the front of the book. And then the last part are short essays, 2-page, by people like Mirabai Starr, David Corton, cosmologist Brian Swin, and so on. Their response to this vision. And I would like to see it take off in Australia, because I know when I talked about this in Ireland, in Dublin, a few weeks ago, they had 40 books and they went like that, and everyone said, I'm going to start we call it a pod, a community, these pods. There's only one vow, and so everyone's welcome from any tradition. And the vow is, I promise to be the best lover of Mother Earth, the best defender of Mother Earth that I can be. That's the vow. So our first vows were taken on the solstice a year ago, and 80 people showed up. It was in a Buddhist center in Berkeley. And there were indigenous people and Buddhists and Hindus and Christians and Jews and Muslims, at least one atheist, 28-year-old woman, came up to me and said, I've been looking for a community who shares my values. This is it. I'm going to join too. So I think it's very important because, as you know, a lot of young people today especially are leaving organized religions. It doesn't mean the world is getting any better, as Deepak Chopra points out. But there's a place, an order by definition is more flexible than a church or a religion. It responds to certain events of the time. And whenever Christianity, I look at the Western history, is in a dive, and that happens periodically. We're certainly in one today. 3rd century, you had when the church started cozying up to the empire, you had what we call desert fathers and mothers, young people at first, who went out to the desert and said, this isn't what Jesus taught me. This doesn't look like that. 5th, 6th century, you had Benedict and Sister Scholastica starting Benedictine order. And then that got corrupt in the 12th century, so then you had Francis and Dominic starting this alternative lifestyle. And then 16th century, I think the Protestant Reformation could be understood as a series of lay orders, each with its own charismatic leader, their own ritual, their own theology, and all that, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and all that. And you had Ignatius, of course, with the Jesuits. But all were responding to the corruption in Rome. So today we're at this other place. It's a very low time. But why not order? And why not an order that combines all the world religions? Because that's who we're rubbing elbows with. And that's the only way the planet's going to be saved anyway, is that everyone be on deck and contribute. And it's not that I want to convert you to my religion, but rather, what does your religion have to offer this planetary crisis? And how about the courage that Islam teaches, or that Buddha teaches, and all the rest? Let's bring it out and make it happen. So I did want to mention this before I leave, because I could see Australians making this happen. I really do. I mean, in your part of the world. And we meet on Zoom once a month. So we have people in South America now in this. We have about 2,500 people, I think, who've taken the vow now. It's only been out, this book's have been out about 6 months. And about 45 pods that we know of in North America and South America. But I just want to throw this out there, because I think it's a halfway between church and nothing. People do need communities, and what's the most obvious value that we share in common today? It is the survival of the planet as we know it. So I just want to throw that in there, and I think this is related to something we were talking about.
It certainly is. Passion.
Passion, that's one thing. Yeah. Creativity. Yeah. And community. You know, organizing
yes.
our common energy. You know, and passion. Organizing it. Yeah, that's right.
True communio, isn't it? Really?
Exactly. Sharing a common task together. Communio. Yeah.